timetable. It's the mention of our mentor, Professor Zakari Muhammad, then the acting university librarian, AHMAD University Zaria, Dr. Abdulhamid Mukambo, then all other participants. Good afternoon. So basically, it is worth noting and understanding that the workshop aimed at describing global best practices in research. And from the first day, that is yesterday, we have understand and learned from different aspects of research, from qualitative perspective, quantitative perspective, mixed method, and global best practices in academic publication. So this afternoon, we have very little to do because we are going to be looking at how that is chapterization. Having conducted your research, yesterday it was described or explained as a process, and others see it as an activity, that is research generally. So after the process and conducting the activity, generally the researcher has come up with his data, record, and is ready now to file out his report. And the report has to be in a particular order. So what this presentation is all about in this afternoon is to try to see the order through which we take, that is how we report what we have found or what we have done. So the presentation outline generally, we are going to be making this presentation this afternoon in the following order. Initially, we'll start with preliminary pages, then we'll go to introduction, review of literature, related literature, methodology, research and discussion, summary, conclusion, and recommendation. Then we'll go to references, and finally we go to what we call appendices. So next slide, please. So generally, based on our discussion today, we are having the background and overview of what we're going to be discussing this afternoon. You can see, yesterday most of the journal has been done yesterday because research has been defined as both a process and what a scientific activity. And through that discussion, we come to reality to understand that paradigms do exist when it comes to research generally. And individuals have their beliefs, individual has their conception, and individual have their perspectives. And every individual has right to his own perspective. And in that respect, issues related to ontologies, that is the belief about reality, issues related to epistemology, that is how do we know what we know, issues related to axiology, that is the cultural and normative issues, and finally methodology were all discussed in the previous, with the previous speakers. So what we're going to be doing here, having all this, we now come back to methodology. It has been discussed clearly by other speakers too. And we all agree that globally, we have three major methodologies, which is quantitative, qualitative, and mixed method. And the workshop has taken care of that from the previous speakers. Then, having undergone this process throughout, then how do you arrange your research report? That is what translates into chapterization. So the preliminary pages we all start with. The first page will always be a title page. That is for project, dissertation, thesis, title, and it should contain that the title of a thesis, when you are stating your title, it should not take more than 23 words. Sometimes you see an individual coming up with a title with about 40, 45, 50. Global best practices and the standard at international level is that it should not exceed 23 words. So then we now come back to declaration and certification. These two pages, I refer to them as a kind of attestation. The first attestation, which is declaration, is an attestation the writer or the researcher is making that whatever that the research is genuine, and it is not copied or is a representation of other people's work. Then the certification, here the supervising or the supervisors are now making a kind of what? Attestation that the work is critically supervised and all the rigor has been taken into consideration. Then dedication, which is also an aspect there. Acknowledgement, there are some individuals that need to be acknowledged, that have given them the financial support, moral support, and most specifically the supervisors who went through the work from beginning to the end. Then you have table of contents, which you are all familiar with. Then if you have these tables that you use within the work, you also have a list separately for that. Then should in case if some diagrams and figures are also captured in your work, then you come back to where we have the list of figures, if any, but if you don't have, it can be neglected. Then we now have the abstract. The last speaker mentioned that abstract should always come at the end. It will come at the beginning, but it will be written at the end of the research. Because actual is the intellectual summary. It is a summary, but the intellectual summary of the entire work. It should capture some aspect of the introduction, an aspect of, that is the methodology. What I mean by the methodology, the research method adapted, the design, going through that is population, come back to the sample, through the method for data analysis, the statistic or otherwise that is being used. Then it will also capture, if you look at the slide there, then the abstract will also capture what we refer to as, that is the findings, then recommendations. Then, immediately after that, then what's next you see in the chapter is what we call the background. In chapterization, background is always, when you go to the main pages, background represents the first part, where you have the chapter 1. And under chapter 1, it is named what? Introduction. Chapter 1 is named what? Introduction. Then under it, you have what we call 1.1, which is the background to the study. Here, there are two different schools of thoughts, which we are going to discuss briefly. The quantitative researchers has a way of writing their background to the study, while the qualitative also have their own way of writing the background to the study. Remember, Dr. Babangida yesterday in his presentation, he mentioned that quantitative researchers are interested in what the variables under study, and they play with the variables. So the background in quantitative research is more interested and focused in the variables. It allows all the variables you have in your work, both the dependent, independent, extraneous, moderating, and whatever type of variable you have, has to be discussed clearly in your background, so that you have a general overview of the introduction. But if you also listen, guys, clearly yesterday, the second speaker, who speaks from qualitative perspective, mentioned that in qualitative research, they are interested in the problem, that is the phenomenon. So in that case, the background here in qualitative paradigm will always focus on the problem itself, not the variables. That is why they speak in that particular area. They use a lot of statistics in their background to justify what the problem is. Then they move further to create a kind of what you call perspective. By understanding what others have done, then they create a knowledge gap. From the background of qualitative, that is when we are expected to see to start seeing the problem. So generally, that is how it is. Then the next thing is 1.2, where you go to the statement of problem. I used to explain that I tell students that when it comes to statement of problem, you must understand the type of research you are conducting before you state your problem. Because basically, research based on use, as explained clearly yesterday, you discover that we have action research and we have fundamental research. Fundamental research or basic research is mainly conducted to close the knowledge gap and move the frontiers of knowledge forward. Is that so? If that is the case, and if your research is fundamental, which more than 80% of academic researches are fundamental researches. So if your research is that, then definitely you have to explain in your statement of problem what others have done and how your study will be different from what they are doing. It's just the gap that you are interested in initiating. But if you are conducting a kind of action research has to do with what? Finding solution or investigating a current problem. It is not mostly done in academic setting, because for instance, we have COVID-19. If you state a problem that you want to investigate COVID-19 and you face it and your research is time-bound, maybe PhD you said is 4 years, master's is 2 years, and after 2 years you have identified problem as COVID, COVID is still existing and the problem has not gone. Can you finish your studies?
No.
And it's just 2 years and now the problem is still there. It has been there since 2019 and 2022. It's also continuously like that. So it's time bound. That is why in most cases, academic researches, they conduct fundamental research. So in stating your problem, these are the two things you put into that is perspective, and the other lecturers have, or other facilitators have explained how to state it clearly. One of which is that you describe the idea. If something is wrong with this one, how is it supposed to look like? Then, when you go to the next paragraph, what happened to the real situation? That is the problem. Is that so? So then, next, we have what we call objectives, and in some cases, it is referred to as purpose of the study. Objectives are derived from the title, from the research title. You have variables, then you derive your objective and state exactly what you want to achieve at the end of that project or at the end of that thesis. And the objectives has to be clearly what stated. The next slide. The next time we have what you call research question and or hypothesis. Research questions or an hypothesis. The questions are always a kind of translation of what you have in your objectives. The research questions are a translation of what you have in your objective. As we learn, and our professor will always tell us, if you have 3 objectives, then you must have 3 research questions. If you have 10 objectives, then research questions are 10. If you have 1 objective, the research question is 1. Is that so? So there's contradiction. If my first research question and the objective is to identify the type of information resources used in narrative library, then my objective number 1 must be to find out or to identify. Is that so? Or what are the types of information resources available in narrative library? So there is direct relationship. Is that so? The other one is in the question form, while the other one is in the sentence form. Is that so? Then we say and or hypothesis. Not all studies will need what hypothesis. Not all studies will need hypothesis. Though it is agreed, it was mentioned that it's not, for example, if you're conducting quantitative researchers don't use what? Hypothesis. Because when you raise hypothesis, meaning that you want to test a relationship or difference, and the tool that facilitate that testing are statistical tools. Is also most specifically inferential statistical tools like Kruskal-Wallis, ANOVA, and whatever you mention. And under the hypothesis, you have been told a different type, so we don't need to explain that here. You have been, a clear explanation was given yesterday with respect to that, where you have the null hypothesis and the alternate hypothesis. Then we now come back to the significance of the study. In writing your significance of the study, the question you ask yourself is the stakeholders, the beneficiaries of the study. And the findings of this study, who will it benefit? Is that so? When you outline the stakeholders, then you explain how each stakeholder will benefit from the study. Then we now have the scope of the study. Here, we have scope of content and we have scope of what place. We cannot just maybe stand up overnight and say that we want to study use of information resources in Nigeria. Is that so? When you say use of information resources in Nigerian libraries, you can see information resources in Nigerian libraries, both academic, is that so? Public, school libraries, research libraries, and there is no even boundary to that. So that is why in the scope, it is always advisable for a researcher to delimit his boundary. Information resources were in academic libraries. Academic libraries in where that is in which places. Then you mention maybe is it in Kaduna State? Is it in that is the scope of place now? So by the time you do that, then others also add that there is scope of time. Some researches are time bound. So you can mention okay between this year to this year, between this academic session to that academic session. Then you justify your reason for delimiting. Then you now come back to what you have operational definition of term. In every study, you discover that there are unique terms, unfamiliar words that are used, which ordinarily not everyone will have a good understanding of what they mean. So you are expected to come down there and list these terms and give explanation in clear terms what these terms mean, not from their concept, not a textbook definition, what it means in your work. Information resources used in digital environment differs from information resources used in that traditional environment. So by information resources, if you are defining operationally, you may mention that, okay, there are information resources used that are in soft copy, even in digital environment, and this was in hard copy. So that operational definition of them is a clear explanation of what specifically you want to do. Next slide. Then that is the end of chapter 1. Then chapter 2 of a research problem is what we call review of related literature. It has been explained clearly by previous researcher what it means. That is, we have theoretical review. The second speaker yesterday did justice to that. Then we have conceptual review or systematic review, which has to go with what with the variables under your research question or objectives. You treat them one after the other. Then there is this issue of empirical study. You don't just write anyhow in literature review, because here you are standing as authority, so you have to cite other authorities. You have to cite other authorities, and you also have to come up with what empirical studies. Like what someone asked yesterday, what happen if you are conducting a study and no study has been conducted about it? I said no. The Greeks, research has been concluded. There is nothing you conduct today that is different from what other. It will be different in terms of perspective. It's just so, but the body of knowledge is already there. And you can always refer back to the body of knowledge, bigger body of knowledge, and domesticate it and narrow it down to your own area. So that is it. So the empirical studies are very important. That will enable you to show the different type of gaps in research. Methodological gap, theoretical gap, and geographical gap, and many other gaps that you mentioned. Then summary. Here, summary of the review literature. This is where a researcher takes position and explain the key, summarize the key component, the key aspect of all the literature he has reviewed. Then he also mentioned how unique his own study is from all other studies conducted. So the major difference, most people will always tell you that in fundamental research that the problem, that is the area discussed, the uniqueness you identify can be your statement of problem. I said no. In the statement of problem, we are more interested in perspective. While here, we are more interested in the gap. Then, chapter 3, research methodology. It will always start with introduction, like every other chapter, where you introduce the chapter and tell the reader his expectations in that particular chapter. Then we have what we call 3.2.2, a research method that will be adopted. So under that research method, we make it a kind of what? It's a pregnant word there, because there are a lot of things to discuss under that. You will discuss your methodology. Basically, remember, I started the presentation by telling you that we have 3 major schools of thought: quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods. So you come through that and choose the one you're using. In some thesis, you will discover that all the 3 will be discussed and their characteristics will be shown. Then you now choose a particular one, then you justify using the characteristics of your study why you are adopting a particular methodology. And each methodology, as discussed by previous scholar, has its own design. Under this, you still take a paragraph and go clearly to explain what your research design is. You said you are using quantitative methodology, and your research methodology, and your research design is phenomenology. You can see it cannot work. Is that so? You are using a kind of quantitative research, and your research design is qualitative case study. So each methodology has its own design, and supervisors are very careful in looking at that area to make sure that you do not mix up what will not work, because it's a kind of journey that you take. So you mention your design and for your methodology, you justify. If it's quantitative, you have to justify. If it's qualitative, you justify. For the design, there is need for a strong justification too, based on what you have in your study. Then from there, you now move to what we call the next thing is population. Is that so? Population, here we have different types of population. You have homogeneous population and you have heterogeneous. when you are bringing two different things together. So the population will represent the entire geography or the entire individuals or object in the location of your study. In most cases, you discover that the residing population is always too much words, too large to control. So that is why we now have what we call sampling, which is the next one. You need to take a part of it, but in taking that part of the population, there must be a technique. You don't just pick anyhow, so that you have equal representation. Each member of the population should be what? Represented. If I'm studying academic libraries in Zaria, meaning that university libraries will have representation. For example, we have college libraries, polytechnics, we all have representation from that. And these techniques, we have different type of techniques which I explained yesterday, and you justify your studies, show you what you take. And whatever you take from the sample, you now make generalization for the population. There is this discussion that I'm still finding difficult to apprehend, that there are certain studies that don't make generalization. I said, is it possible? It is always said that in qualitative studies there is no generalization. Why is it that there is no generalization? For example, if I want to conduct qualitative study of information behavior of asthma patients in Zaria, and at the point of data collection, I interviewed 8 and reached what we call saturation. Any other result I get after that is a replication of what others have gotten. And I stop at that 8. My interview is 8. Is that so? And maybe in Zaria, we have 100 asthma patients. So at the end of the day, when I'm making my kind of conclusion, will I say that I only studied 8 and the 8 will remain there? How about others that were not interviewed? So by the time I'm discussing asthma patient, am I not generalizing? So I still find it difficult to agree that there's no generalization in qualitative research. Though, remember, the ontological perspective is a belief. Research, you have your belief and stand by it. Is that so? Then we have instrument for data collection. There, your population, your sample will determine the type of instrument you adopt. Is it a questionnaire or the type of research you conduct? Is it interview, observation, or whatever method? Then we have validity of the instrument. You don't just wake up overnight, come up with an instrument, then believe that the instrument will measure what your objective will help you to achieve your objectives. No, there is need for what validation. And in most cases in academic setting, individuals that make this validation are the supervisors, because they are more knowledgeable, or they are more knowledgeable, or you present what you have to them, and they check if the items in the questionnaire will actually answer the questions you have in your objectives. Or in the case of qualitative research or interview, you have an interview guide, you also subject it, is also to your supervisor for verification. The aim of it is that you should not go and look for your study, want to find out information resources in AHMAD University's area, and your options are showing information services. Is that so? At the end of the day, you will report nothing, and the objectives of that study will not be achieved. Is that so? So that is it. And under that validity, you were told and taught the different type of validity, from face validity, content, construct, and whatever. Then we have reliability. Here, you want to test how reliable is this instrument. It has been subjected to validity, you have passed that stage. Then now, you just go into the field and start maybe administering maybe questionnaire, or you go and conduct maybe interview. No, you don't do that. You subject it to what we call reliability. And the reliability test, you always conduct what we call pilot study. You take a population that have similar characteristics with your population. For example, I'm studying students in AHMAD University's area. Then individuals, learners in FC's area are also students. Kaduna State University, we have students there. Is that so? Covenant University, we have students there. So you can use that instrument, share maybe a very little number of that instrument, maybe 10, 12, or whatever number you agree on, based on the scholarly agreements. Is that so? You take that instrument there, share the questionnaire to individuals with similar characteristics, collect the data, and validate and test it using Chrombat Alpha and whatever. And when you do it, then there is a kind of a scale used in measuring that. When it is above 0.7 and whatever, it is reliable. If it is, then you come back and use it on for your population. The same thing with the interview. That is what the second speaker also reiterated yesterday, that in the interview, sometimes you conduct focus group interview, where all the participants are called in a meeting, and you present through a research question for them to discuss. That the focus group is also used to validate interview guides. And at the same time, it is also used to triangulate. You collect data from one-on-one interview, you collect data from focus group interview, then you analyze this differently and check if there are similarities or differences. And it also helps with your familiarization. So that is for the then procedure for data collection. In collecting data, you now explain under procedure for data collection how practically you go into the field and get the research data required. That is, now I'm studying students, undergraduate students, AHMAD University's area. How many weeks will it take me to meet those individuals and collect the necessary data if it is questionnaire? And if it is an interview, how do you conduct the interview? You normally have what you call the moderator, which is the main researcher, the assistant moderator, who will handle the ICTs and whatever that you use in the work, and you explain how it is. It all goes through. So then you now have what you call method of data analysis. From whatever perspective, they have their respective method. You go to quantitative, you analyze using statistic, descriptive or inferential. You use descriptive statistic, that is mean, standard deviation, frequency, and whatever for research questions. Then you also use inferential statistics, chi-square, t-test, ANOVA, Kruskal-Wallis, and whatever to test your hypothesis, which were clearly explained yesterday. The next. Then going to the chapter 4, I said that this is where you report your findings and present them in a systematic manner. It should be reported in sufficient details to justify any conclusion. Then the use of tables, figures are judiciously utilized. So we mentioned that you should start the result section with an introduction, just like other sections. You should always introduce every chapter of your research so that the reader, the user of your research will now understand what his or her expectation is in that area. So then the result of the study is presented in accordance with the research questions. You have 3 research questions, one on the type of information resources available, second on the access to information resources, third on use of information resources. So your tables should go in this order. In chapter 4, we should start with the availability, then move to access before going to utilization or use. You have 3 research questions. Your last research question is utilization, and your first table is this. You are listing of things. Because there is a kind of transition in thesis. An individual will go to your chapter 1 and check your objectives. From there, you will move straight to chapter 2 and check how you arrange your literature, because there must be a relationship. Then next, you will move to your tables and see how they are arranged. Then finally, you will go to your findings and see how you summarize the findings. Finally, and then you also go to recommendation. So that is just what we try to, we said that you should answer the research questions, 4.4.1, research question 1. Point 2, research question 2, 4.4, 4.1.3, research question 3, etc. Even if you have 10 research questions. Next slide. Then immediately after that, if you have hypotheses, then you move on and continue with the analysis for hypothesis. Then that is how you do it. In the other way, if you are analyzing using what? If you are analyzing qualitative data, then you use what we call thematic analysis, as explained yesterday by the qualitative speaker, and you also use what we call document content analysis, which every objective will stand as a theme, and all responses under that objective will be grouped under that particular theme, and that will form the basis for your analysis form the basis for discussion in the chapter 4. Then in that same chapter, for every analysis you make in a table, You interpret the table and explain what it is. Then you come under and make what we call discussion. That is where your expertise as an expert in that area is expected. Then you also contradict or support with literature. This is why in some theses you see individuals having chapter 6, while others have chapter 5. And subsequent chapters, some will tell you that they have up to chapter 8. The only thing that is different is that those that have the belief of moving to chapter 6 is here. Under chapter 4, they make only disclose, they don't discuss. They only interpret what is in the table. Then they create a chapter for discussion. So it's the same thing. They create a chapter for discussion. And some will even say that every variable or every research question should be given a chapter. The discussion should be given a chapter. That is when you have 8, 9, 10, and other things. But no matter how the research is, whatever it is, it's still the same thing. The content still remain what? The same. Especially in mixed method. Then in the case of mixed method, sometimes you discover that they triangulate a mix. They collect data quantitatively and analyze using statistical tools. Then they collect qualitative data, then they analyze using that methodology. Then they create another chapter where they go and show what the relationship between the qualitative results and the quantitative results. That is what translates into another chapter. So whatever they do is still the same thing. It's still the same message that we have. So next chapter. Then chapter 5 is what we call summary, conclusion, and recommendation. In summary, we have two summaries there. We have summary of the study and we have summary of findings. Summary of the study, the researcher is expected to summarize in not more than 3 paragraphs his chapter 1 to 3 proposal stage. Then it all stops there as summary of what? The study. In most cases, it is called 5.2. Then you now move to 5.3, summary of findings. Then you now summarize, you give a summary of all what you have in your chapter 4. That is, for research question number 1, what did you find? The table has explained a lot of things. Then in 1 sentence, summarize it. Then you come to number 2, summarize in 1 sentence. Come to number 3, summarize it in 1 or 2, highest. In very brief explanation. Then we now go to what we call, immediately after that, then the researcher take position. Having done all this, then you now make a kind of conclusion. You are now interplaying between what you discuss and what you have in your finding. Then what have you succeeded in doing? Then you take position and give explanation. Then you now move to recommendation. You go to research question number 1. You find out that, okay, you said that what type of information resources are available. You got textbook and there are no journals based on the table. So in your recommendation, you now explain practically how do we make journals available. Your weak findings in the table from the table is what you use for your recommendations. The positive findings are there in summary of findings. Then the weak findings, you make recommendation based on them. Recommendation number 1, research question, finding number 1, you make recommendation for it. Number 2, number 3, continuously. Then here you now come back and have your references, then list of appendices, which is your questionnaire, tables, and whatever you have. And the next slide. Thank you for listening.
So thank you very much, co-participant. Well presented and articulated. Well presented and articulated. I wanted to ask a question on this issue of chapters, multiple chapters, but the answer was provided. However, I have other questions here. What is the position of an instrument without validity, without reliability? It has been subjected to validity, but the reliability is not there. Like it is obtainable in some departments of AU, where master's students are advised not to even go for reliability, there's only validity. But those conducting PhD and has doctoral research asked to do the validity and the reliability. That's validation and reliability. And then in chapter 4, where exactly do we place demographic characteristics or data of the respondents? Because that was not mentioned. I checked very well, it was not among those issues presented. And another one is that conclusion, summary, recommendation in chapter 5. I cannot find where limitation, then recommendations for further studies, not stated there. Then thesis, dissertation. Those years when we were there for our masters, the masters study was called thesis. Then those for PhD were dissertation. But now the reverse is the case. What is the rationale behind that? So I need an answer to that. I think, let me just stop here for others to continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. My question is related to chapter 1. You made mention of your background, your problem statement, and emphasis. In health-related research, because I'm from health-related there is sometimes you have to mention like the burden of the program we are investigating or carrying out a research on a particular disease. You are meant to like state the burden of the disease. So is that like a modification or an addition? Also, I need a clarification on that. Thank you.
That is in the introduction or in the background?
Chapter 1, in the chapter 1.
We're not going to here.
Yes.
Please, I have a question. My question is regards to population of the study. For instance, you are investigating a particular behavioral problem, and your study area is within, let's say, Zaria Metropolis Secondary School. My question is, who are those that will constitute your population? Is it the entire student, or those with those behavioral problems that you narrow down your research population to?
Okay, for that, you define that in your scope. What you define in your scope will define who you take as your population. If you must have delimited to maybe students with SUSO or individuals with SUSO, that will directly be what you have, because there is a direct relationship between your scope and your population.
Thank you, Mr. Presenter, for the snappy presentation. My concern is in chapter 1, you find out that in some researches that there is justification of the study, and also there is significance of the study. So should the chapter contain both or only one? That's my question number 1. Please, the second one is a plea. If you can elaborate on this conceptual and theoretical framework. Then the next one is contribution to knowledge. Is it going to fall under chapter 5 or it has no chapter? Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Mine is on area of specialization. I'm a graduate from Human Kinetics and Health Education, ABU Zaria. Can I write my thesis or research on library and information science? Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. My point of view is under reliability. Actually, what brought me here I came here for the purpose just to correct some impressions, in my department. So I want to get some certain things right. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Public Administration. Here, I want to know at what percentage of your sample size should be used for pilot study or testing. Then secondly, I have a question on the significance of study. See, some departments, or should I say, some lecturers, will ask you to cite authors who have written in your discipline or your area. Then tell us why your own is different. Why some will say you should state it in your statement of problem. So I want to, because I'm here for a global standard. So which one should we? Because in your significance of the study, you said to indicate those that will benefit from it and how. And this is what I know it of. But after my MSc, I did MSc here and I'm doing my PhD currently. So I want to know the global standard.
Mine is, what is the ideal sample size for an experimental research? And again, is there any specific number of articles you will review for conceptual, for empirical review and conceptual review?
Somebody's here.
Well done, Mr. Presenter. My question here is on two things. One, in chapter 5, you mentioned on your heading, you said summary, conclusion, and recommendation. What I'm meant to understand is there are more than this subheadings under chapter 5. So why are they not included on the subheadings? The second is, you still mentioned issue of summary of findings and summary of the study. Are they all supposed to be in chapter 5? That's just one question.
Good afternoon all. Thank you, Mr. Presenter, for the very precise presentation. I have the following questions. Number one, sir, what is the global best practice in writing dedication in preliminary pages? Another question, sir, some projects in chapter 1, I used to see organization of the study. Is that organization of the study, is that important or is not important?
Organization of the study?
Yes, sir.
It's not important. That is exactly what I did at the beginning of this presentation. I started the presentation outline. It's just to give an insight of your expectation.
Okay, sir.
It's not necessary.
Okay, sir. Another question, sir. In the statement of the problem, must a researcher cite someone or he can go ahead without citing any person? Then the last question, sir. Assuming I am conducting a research on HIV patient, I believe at some point in time I may decide to use snowball to get the respondents. How can I determine my sample size? Thank you, sir.
I'm here
again. The issue of population and sample. Yesterday, it was mentioned that Piaget conducted a research on 2 subjects. So, can we have a research population without sample? Because sample is the representation of the entire population in a situation where you have a large population. But what if the population is not all that large? Can we leave it and forget about sample?
All right, sir, you can go.
Okay, let me take the questions. that I will answer, and the ones I cannot, that is why we are confident. Our teacher is always here to answer the rest. So on the first one, you said the position of instruments without reliability. An instrument, ordinarily, we have two types of instruments. An instrument can either be adapted or adopted, or even three, self-constructed. Is that so? Yes. If that instrument is self-developed, it must be subjected to validity and reliability. But if you are adopting it, it is allowed in research. Is that so? Where you want to study a problem, then you have an instrument that has been used by other researchers to study that same problem. And the result, the instrument has no problem, you can adopt it the way it is. So if you adopt it, that is where your researchers or the supervisors will tell you not to go for one pilot study, because the instrument has been tested already. Is that so? So that is the condition. Then number two, demographic placement in chapter 2. In chapter 4, not all researches need what? Demographic information. Because why do you come up with the demography? Maybe because you want to check certain differences or relationship in line with your hypothesis. And if it doesn't have, but if you have the demography indeed, it should always be, the analysis should always come before the analysis of the research questions. So that is the placement. Then number 3, you said limitation and contribution to knowledge were not mentioned. Is that so? Limitation of the study is supposed to be ideally in chapter 5, because that is where a researcher is expected to explain the challenges he encounters in the process of conducting that study, ranging from scarcity of literature, geographical barriers, and other things like that. So until you finish the study, before you know where your challenges lies. Then coming to contribution to knowledge. Contribution to knowledge also comes in chapter 5. I think the question was even repeated by somebody, so we're not going to answer it. So the contribution to knowledge, there are different contributions to knowledge. Different ways you can contribute to knowledge. One of it represents your unique findings. Number 2, it can also be a difference in the use of what theory. The first theory, the first research used Alfred Chapman, Alfred Trump, immunization or to whatever. Then the second one, you can now use another theory to test if you still get the same finding. So that theoretical ability you have, you can also represent a contribution to knowledge. Then methodology. I can study a problem quantitatively, and tomorrow you decide to study it qualitatively to see the results will be that. That methodology can serve as what? Quantitative. But even though in most of our educational institutions today, they will always tell you that unique findings only represent growth. Unique findings, yes, they are contribution to knowledge, but they are not the only contribution to knowledge. Even geographical diversification. A study has been conducted in Kenya, and I want to do it here in Nigeria as a contribution to knowledge. So that is how it is. And it is supposed to come in chapter 5, too. So then, suggestion for further study. Mostly, you look throughout your discussion. When you are discussing your findings, there are areas you look at that are not treated well. Then you can give suggestion for those to be studied further. You can go back to your scope. The areas, maybe it is too large, areas you neglect in your studies deliberately, then you can also give recommendation. It is also at the end of chapter 5. Then we now have the burden of disease. Is it supposed to be in chapter 1? Where is it supposed to be in chapter 1? That is what I meant. In medical science, most of the researches conducted in medical science are quantitative researches, because they do with active problem and societal issues. So in that respect, even from your background, an element of the problem of that body is supposed to be shown, even though it will still be stated clearly in your statement of problem. Because that is what will inform the research generally. So in the statement of problem, the reader will expect to see how the disease burdens what? The society.
So does that mean it doesn't have to carry one head subhead?
Burden, no.
It doesn't.
But let me also make something clear here. Research is a tradition. And every academic department is also has its tradition. So there is no simple definition or one way of doing things, even at the global world perspective. Is that so? So whatever we do here.
Madam, thank you for your presentation. I just want to do certain questions that like you were saying, in regards to certain questions that were raised. You see, there are traditions, and from my little knowledge of our academic institutions, every department has a tradition. That is a pattern, a way of doing things. Like the issue of the disease burden that you're talking about. I think it's disease burden you said. Yeah. You see, if you are in the medical field and you're trying to conduct a study on a disease. And part of the reasons, one of the major reasons why you conduct studies in the medical sciences is because a disease is a burden. And you want to conduct a research on it, they want you to really state clearly what is the extent of the burden of the disease that is warranting you to conduct that study. So it is a tradition in the medical research from where you come from that particular aspect has to have a heading. So you have to follow that trend because that is the guideline. So every department or program or discipline has a template. All right? So if you are conducting a research within that particular context, then you have to look at what is the template of that context, and then you follow it based on that template altogether. But there are issues of global best practice, and global best practice are based on disciplines. That is why you need to go for workshops. That's why you need to go for conferences. We have what we call scholarly content area or scholarly body of knowledge. When you go for conferences, it's only people within that discipline or body of knowledge that presents there, and they have their own way of doing things. So that is where you get the global best practice from. Because globally, the conference, all stakeholders in that particular area will go there and they agree that this is our style and this is our format. So that is where you get the global best practice. Because it's more like a unanimous agreement of those people belonging to that particular scholarly area that this is how we do our things. And you have to follow it. And that is why it's called a tradition. It's a belief. So people come together and believe that this is how we want to do our things. So if you want to belong, you have to do it that way or you will be what? Left out. So the same thing with my brother from public admin. If you have a style in your department, then you have to follow that style. If you go outside the style, you have problems. Are we getting the point? It's just like the presenter, the previous presenter on journal publications. You can't publish in a journal without knowing the regulations and their templates. Because if you send it, they will just reject it outrightly. Because it doesn't conform. So in whatever context you are going to write, look at what is required in that context and go along with what that context. Thank you very much.
Okay, the next question is the graduate of kinetic, writing thesis in library application science. So yesterday during our second presentation, Dr. Hayatu presented a kind of an elephant and how the 6 blind men in the ancient Australia view the elephants. That is what he's telling you about what research perspective. You have a societal problem, a library problem that you can view from kinetic perspective. Maybe you want to check our energy as librarians, the kind of energy we discharge in Chapterisation. Is that so? Yes. So you can come in, but you cannot just leave your area. One of the things that you make your thesis, we make the postgraduate school to award your thesis is the contribution to that particular area of your study. So if you are going for library science, that means you are coming back to library science, do your PhD and get an admission. Then you conduct your research there. But your area of study matters much. Then the percentage of sample size you should use for a pilot study. The percentage. And the ideal sample size. I want to join the two questions together. Whatever you are doing in research, or whatever you are, whatever you're doing in research, you should make sure that you have justification. Scholars have different views in this respect, and we have more than 2,000 of that. So it depends on you taking a certain percentage, then you have a scholar or scholarly perspective to back what you have done. Is that so? Like our supervisor will always tell us not to rush into writing. Read before you write. Because if you start writing without reading, you mess up. Is that so? So you look at what others have said and you come back to it. The number of articles or number of empirical works needed in the empirical study area and whatever, there is no globally accepted number of literature you write down you review in your, there is some of empirical study. But schools and departments do agree on that. I know of departments that said 80, 30 local, 50 international. I know of departments that go with 15, 5 local, 10 international. Some departments go with 25. So you go to your department, whatever they have there, because your graduation is strictly based on adherence to the tradition of the department.
Sorry, I forgot. The one from human kinetics and health education. You see, in library information science, we are everywhere. So that was what my very senior colleague was saying earlier. If you come to our department and you see researchers that are medically inclined, that are computer science inclined. Do you know why? Because information is everywhere. There is no discipline without what? Information. So if you want to study human kinetics from an information perspective, come for consultation. We just take a phenomenon in human kinetics or health education and we'll give it an informational perspective, which will suit into information science at the same time your human kinetics. Thank you.
Okay, then here, that is the summary of study and summary of finding. They should all be in what? In chapter 5, one following the other. The first will be summary of study, to summarize the proposal 1 to 3, then summary of finding, to summarize in chapter 4. That's when it's answered. Then must a researcher cite a statement of problem. It's not a must, but you will cite. There are instances that you warrant that you must cite. Then there are instances that you warrant that you don't cite. Some of the researches we conducted, their lived experiences. Something will just happen, and you pick your project. You're there, you now have your problem. I could remember during our master's class, we were having a classwork, and one of us, I think she's sitting there, she just came in, and we have an assignment to submit that morning, and she lost that assignment. Her system didn't have that problem, and she don't know how to go about doing it. And that was at the point I picked my research problem, and that's what I did. Yes. So you can see that you can write practically what it is. From practical experience, you can get your research problem, then you can also go through literature. When you are conducting fundamental research, you must cite literatures that have been conducted before, because you are trying to create a knowledge gap. Is that so? Yes. But like the other one in medical sciences, some of the problems, they are topical, they are just, there are current problems happening, so they can just write and do whatever. But if there is a body of knowledge that will support, it is always better you also write to support, but you can write a statement of problem without citation. Then the one with snowball, he said if he's using snowball, how will he determine his sample size? In qualitative study, most of the things you don't even conclude until you finish your study. Even your title, it will change after chapter 1. Going to chapter 2, with literature, it will modify that. Going to chapter 3, it will change that. So your sample, you need the first one under snowball. You interview the individual, then he chain you with the second person. You go there, at the point where you meet your saturation, then you can now agree that this is what you have gotten as your study participant. Then you present.
Sorry, during your presentation, you made mention that in determining sample size, you must have a reason. So what would be my reasons for the sample size, for determining sample size?
The reason for determining sample size, okay, they are scholarly body of knowledge, authorities. For example, now we have Craigie and Morgan. It will tell you that this is what you take when you have this number. That is the reason. Is that so? We have other scholars. We have Bernard, 2012. This is his reason. He said that, okay, like the other one that said, can you take the whole population? For instance, now Bernard, in his own opinion, he said that if the population is less than 200, you can take all. And even Creswell has similar opinion. Is that so? So continuously like that. So that is why I say you don't write without reading. In research, you read for 10 days or for 10 months and write one paragraph. That is how it is. There is no two way to read research. More than what sitting and reading, understand with it, then listening to scholars, listening to cognitive authorities, and attend gatherings where such things are well discussed. That is the only way we do research. But there is no shortcut to it. Okay, the difference between dissertation and thesis. Yes, at my own point in masters, I wrote dissertation and I was told that it has been changed to thesis. That is why I told you that I'm very confident here because my teachers are there to explain what I'm not clear.
We'll come to the end of.
Please, keep on dedication. Someone asked a question.
On what?
Dedication.
Dedication.
Yes.
Okay.
Global best practice. Global best practice.
Global best practice. Okay, when you are writing dedication.
One house, please.
In dedication, you are dedicating a work, is that so, to individual or individuals or a body. Is that so? And what that means is that once a work is dedicated to a particular person or group of people, it shows that whatever benefits that work derive in the future, that individual the work is dedicated to stands to benefit from it. If you dedicate your research project to your wife, and at the end of the day they said that it has won a grant, and now there's a benefit of 1 million, it goes to her. Is that so? Is that so? So that is just what it is. I think we should listen to the last question now.
Okay, sorry, there is no any other last question. We have run out of time. So sorry.
My question has not been answered.
Yes, sorry. We are going to answer it, but Prof is going to. But before then, there is this research done by Creswell in one of his research design methodology, and he said that talking about global best practices. So the advice he gave when he take a concept from one paradigm or one design or something or whatever, after explanation at the end, he will tell you that he is advising his student or whosoever in the world to follow the tradition of their supervisor committee. So there is no any standard global best practice for a particular
Well, that's the good thing about listening to people talking. Sometimes they will answer your questions or they make life easy for you not to say anything. And that is what has actually happened. Really, for you to be a successful student, especially postgraduate student or researcher, go by the tradition of the environment you find yourself. Once you can do that, you are free. Because it doesn't make any sense, you waste your time, write whatever you feel is good, and then when you submit it, they say that no, this is not how we do it. You know, it can be very, very frustrating. I remember there was a time when, that was about 5 years ago, when I won't mention who, somebody's work was written and he gave us 6 chapters. We said no. In our department, we only know of 5 chapters. Then, as the presenter said, instead of having another chapter for discussion of issues, you have to integrate it in your findings, and that is the tradition. And one thing which I would want to add is that in some departments, for example, they will write the research questions and then discuss whatever it is. But in another department, they will say no. Instead of writing the research question, you formulate a topic out of the research question and then make your presentation and discuss it. So it varies from department, university to university. What is most important, what he has succeeded in doing is that this is the minimum. But if there is maximum, go ahead and do it. I remember the speaker this morning was saying that there are instances where you even have up to 8 chapters of a work. That is the way they want it, and there is nothing you can do about it. The important is to do what they ask you to do, so that you get what you want to get, and then you stop there. They have said virtually everything. Research question I've already talked about. The sample size he has already explained what it is. Please let us answer this man. What were your questions before we went on?
Okay, justification of the study and significance of the study. Can they all be lumped in chapter 1, or you only have one of the 2?
No, justification of the study and as I said, as we all agree, it's a matter of tradition. But you find that there are 2 different things. To justify something is different from significance. So how do you lump them together? Ordinarily.
The same chapter?
Yes. No, I'm not talking about it. For example, they have just produced whatever they want to produce. They want to give you. You can justify why you want to eat it. Probably because you have registered, you pay for registration. That is why you decide to eat. At least you have chopped your money. And then the significance of what value would the food add to your health when you eat it and you don't eat it. There are some of us that will not eat because we realize that it has no value on our body. And we didn't justify it because there was no need for it. So take note of it. Significance of study and whatever it is, they are 2 different things. But it's also good if you can. And that is why I always tell that when in my class I used to say, justification, you ask this question, of what benefit will it be? Of what benefit will it be? From that, and then you'll be able to make your way out. I think we have come to the end of the session. What is it? Thesis and dissertation. You have already been answered. It's a matter of tradition. It's a matter of tradition. There is the American style, there is the British style, there is the European style. Before in ABU, for example, if you are writing a PhD, they call it dissertation. If you are writing a master's or MPhil, they are called thesis. But now the reverse is the case. They are now following American style. And that's why things have changed. But the European style, you have thesis and dissertation. Because by the time you mention dissertation, the first thing that people think about is PhD. But since they want to make it free, American style, what happens? So please, these are minor things that you don't even have to waste your time. The important thing is get familiar with the tradition of the environment and go by their style so that you can have your peace and collect whatever you have come for. That's all.
Sorry, I want to make an announcement. So all the participants present, I would like to tell you that both the material for all the presentation for the workshop and your certificate will be sent to you via your emails. So please, before you go, you should check your email if it is correct. If there is any mistake, you correct it before you go, because everything will be sent to your mails. Thank you. So I want to seize this opportunity to especially appreciate the effort of the chief host in person of Professor Zakari Muhammad in ensuring the success of this program. And also I want to appreciate the effort of the host in person of the acting university librarian, Alhaji Abdulhamid Kambo, the director of NARIT, National Research Institute of Chemical Technology. I want to appreciate his the opportunity given to us to host this event here. Thank you very much, and thank you the staff of NARIT. I want to appreciate their efforts, the librarian of NARIT, in ensuring the neatness of the venue. I want to also appreciate the facilitators in person of Dr. Babangida Ahmad, Dr. Hayatu, Malan Ahmad, Dr. Yusuf from Physics, and the rest. So, and for our participants present, physically present and virtually connected, I want to appreciate you for being patient and your time. We hope to meet again in our next workshop, which is coming up very soon. So we are going to send a survey to every participant in the group. So you're going to put in your feedback and responses, and inshallah we are going to make correction on whatever it is and the challenge we're facing. Thank you.